Chapter 11 of Sinister House by Leland Hall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 11. In the room, Annette was the first to move. She turned off the gas which was escaping from the burner. Then she came and took my arm. Together we looked down at Eric, still kneeling, bent over the head of his wife, a figure of unutterable woe. Was Julia dead? She did not move. She did not make a sound. Eric, too, was motionless and silent. We waited a long time, my wife and I. At last she went softly up to Eric and touched his shoulder, and when even then he did not notice us, she raised his head and with calm tenderness asked, "Is Julia living, Eric?" He merely looked up at her dumbly, so she lifted Julia from his arms and let her down on the bed. She lay as white and as peaceful as marble, but she was not cold. She lived. After we had watched her for half an hour, and were assured that she slept tranquilly and unmolested, Annette directed my attention to Eric, who all that time had remained sitting cross-legged on the floor, his head dropped low over his chest. I roused him from his profound absorption, made him understand that he too must go to bed and sleep, and gave him a hand to help him to his feet. He was dazed, and already a little out of his head again. I let him stand and look down at Julia a while, but he said nothing, and though his gaze was fixed upon her face, his look was vague. He followed me meekly enough into the next room, and without a murmur, let me undress him and get him to bed. But instead of falling into a reposeful sleep, he became more and more restless, his face flushed with fever, and his sunken eyes began to blaze with delirious excitement. Yet I felt strangely relieved. The instinct which had informed me that the happiness of Eric and Julia was menaced by a secret peril now assured me no less certainly that that peril, the nature of which had been revealed to me, was exorcised and banished. The time I spent at Eric's bedside seemed to me, for all the darkness, the cold, and the unelectric night wind of autumn, like the relaxed afternoon hours which follow a heavy thunderstorm in midsummer. Between Julia and the sun, the jet-black clouds of Eric's past life had mounted. I had been beside her in the ever-deepening shadow, had shared with her the dread of destructive wild forces, not knowing when they would be entirely loosened, or where or how they would strike. But we had withstood the worst, and now I felt as I have felt looking upon the rear of such storms, softened by the mists of recent rain in the air, majestic, yet no longer threatening, a jumbled and indistinct splendor. Of course, this was only a queer vision in my mind, which, while relieved of the worst anxiety, was tired and vaporish. Nothing I have since learned of Morgan Snart and his daughter could suggest a comparison with any of the magnificent aspects of nature, not even with the cruel beasts or with cold-blooded and repugnant creatures of what we call lower forms of life. They were a cold and an unkind pair. They remained unwarmed even by the suffering they inflicted upon others, which nonetheless apparently thrilled some secret nerve of voluptuousness within them. But there was a wild and, for the moment, a ruined splendor about Eric. It was a strange waning of the night I passed through by his bed. Not until just before dawn did his ravings become quite incoherent, and for more than an hour I answered his odd questions in hopes that he would quiet down. When he sat up in bed, I pressed him back as gently as I could. I can see him well now as I write, tall and thin, his old-fashioned nightgown — I'd sought for pajamas, but could find none — hanging loose and open from his shoulders when, before I got him to lie down again, he would sit, leaning forward over his knees. I remember clearly certain looks on his face, especially the sober thoughtfulness in his eyes when for the first few times he mentioned the telegram. He spoke of this again and again, in the midst of a gentle discourse on the merits of Jonathan Edwards, or if something sentimental about the return of a lost lamb to the fold, he would say, "I have always thought telegrams brought bad news, but it was good news. I must always be honest. Of course, God knew that I was glad to hear that he too was dead. God sent the automobile against him, but I no longer believe he did that to please me. I did not think I could be so glad again. She must have been dead a long time. She was stiff on the floor. I would not touch her. No, but the telegram with the glad tidings. I laid it across her dead hand. Oh no, that would not have killed her. I closed her fingers with my foot, but my shoe was on it. I would not have touched her, and I am sure I did not step on her hand. Then, when I thought he was about to lose this train of thought, he invariably went on. You did not think that telegram killed her, did you? I assure you I did not kill her either. Her heart split with wickedness while I was out of doors. I ran very fast away from the house because I hated her so, and I walked very slowly back because I did not know what to do. Her heart split with wickedness while I was away, and she fell down dead on the floor. That is why I put the telegram in her dead hand. It was a perfect vengeance. He would have died a second time to know that I got his money. So little, too. I have put this down more coherently than he said it, but even from his confused ramblings that night I guessed what his crime had been. As I tell you, he went through this cycle of thought many times, and feverish as he was, he had a way of fastening his eyes on mine each time he went through it, always with the same sober thoughtfulness I have mentioned. I'm glad to say I never caught in them the faintest glimmer of craftiness or calculation. As he grew wilder, his repetitions of the story were less and less detailed, but he insisted with louder and firmer voice that she died before he did, and that he had punished them, just as if he took great pride in letting the world know that he alone had been able to execute a proper vengeance upon them. I shall never know precisely what was in his mind when, by the mere act of laying the telegram in the dead Huldah's hand, he made it appear beyond question that the news of her father's sudden death had killed her. That he did so deliberately I did not doubt, with a wholly acute realization that his act would make him heir to whatever Morgan Snart had willed to his daughter. But that he acted from covetousness I will never believe. Some hardly more than instinctive demand for retribution, a cold passion for revenge, a single lust for triumph over them. Something of all those, I think, sprang into one swift, clear, and irrevocable act, the revolt from their persistent and consciously refined cruelties. Subsequently, he could not have escaped the knowledge that he had committed an act that made him a criminal in the eyes of the law. But the small inheritance he had acquired, the old house in Stanton and some broken-down property in Buffalo, remained for him the hard and fast substance of his victory over Huldah and Morgan Snart, and he would never relinquish it. He brought Julia to see the house behind the hemlocks. He had never been in it before, because he imagined that to be happy there with her would make that victory supreme. Well, they had risen up to score on him again, and the second scoring was more terrible than the first. I assure you that I had no curiosity in regard to the details of what he had lived through with them, how or where he ever met the wicked woman who wore upon his early religious fervor, hypnotized him, and finally married him, perhaps only to torture his fine sensibilities. I have never sought to learn. Of what seethed up out of the mutilated heart while I sat by his bed, I have only fragmentary recollections. Much was too painful to bear repeating. None of us knows how sensitive the other fellow may be. Some things, such as the wanton uprooting of the few flowers he had planted secretly, and the stripping of everything of beauty and comfort from the house, wounded him deeply. One might be tempted to think him a softy for that. Others, the crude disfigurement of his mother's photograph and the cutting off by lies and malice of every soul disposed to be friendly to him, would have made most men entirely angry. But Eric, until he finally turned against him, suffered in heart, first surprised, later afraid and horrified. When he did turn, it was over an unmentionable piece of cruelty to a bird. His revulsion of feeling was so fierce that he never got over it. More than, I imagine, the surface of the earth rent by a volcanic eruption ever becomes whole again as it was before. It was about 4:30 when he began humming, and from then on he was hardly sane for a minute. He sang snatches of hymns, not quiet old household favorites, but wild revival hymns which make the blood curdle. And though it was the rising fever that was overthrowing his reason, I think he maddened himself a good deal with his own singing, as I have been told fanatical persons often do. Between the crazy strains of song he would sometimes subside, to say such things as, "When I was a boy I loved flowers, yet my mother was a Christian woman," or, "I loved animals, and they are God's creatures like the rest of us." Aye, like the rest of us. All but that cursed pair that must have been weaned in a hell of ice before they ever came upon this earth. At the height of his frenzy he sprang out of bed and shouted, shaking his fist defiantly above his head, "No, I was not created for suffering!" With the help of Annette, who had been roused from her slumber at Julia's bed by his cry, I got him back where he belonged. He had exhausted his strength in a wild reenactment of his great outburst upon Hulda. Just before he relapsed into complete unconsciousness, he had a moment's calm, in which he looked up at Annette, mistaking her for Julia, and said tenderly, "She will not dare haunt me, dear. I frightened her to death, and she will be shut up fast in hell for her wickedness." There was something so childlike and pathetic in the way he said this that the tears came into my eyes. It doesn't do any good at all to say boo at the past when you're afraid of it. I went over to the window and parted the curtains. The night was just beginning to give way. I couldn't see the river in the deep shadow of its gorge, but to the right I could make out against the dim gray sky the bowing and slipping of the hemlock tops and the cold and steady wind. I don't know why I recalled the picture of my wife's walking up and down with her son in her arms, shouting boo at the horrid dream. How they had dogged poor Eric. How terribly they had scored against him once more. But I had faith that against him and Julia united, they should never hereafter prevail. Annette said I had better go for the doctor, so I stole out of the chamber. But when I found myself in the dark upper hallway, the memory of how earlier in the night we had struggled up the stairs against the nameless, and then invisible evil swept over me like a chill. For a moment I lost my nerve. I slunk back into Eric's room for another word with Annette. I didn't like to leave her and go down those stairs alone. I took a good long look at Eric's flushed face. Even in his ravings there had been something human, something warm. "What's the matter?" my wife asked me. "I don't know," I answered foolishly. "I feel queer in that hallway. It's cold and ruined." I saw her turn pale. "They will not come back again," she whispered. "It gives me the creeps." But I wasn't going to ask her to come downstairs with me. I returned to the hall alone and started down. The drafts were icy cold. I noticed with a sick feeling at my heart that the banister rails had been broken, and the rose damask that had hung down from the upper wall had been pulled from its fastenings, and was all awry and torn. Halfway down I felt as if I could go no farther over the way those fiends had made off on. There was a sort of dim gray luminousness in the lower hallway, the dawn stealing in through the front door, in which the glass panels had been smashed. The curtains that used to cover them had been ripped from their rods and dangled in tatters to the floor from the edges of the broken panes. I think I was about to break into tears, but my strained eyes caught sight of something that stiffened me with horror. Prone on the floor at the foot of the stairs, amid all the debris, lay Giles. I whispered his name. He did not answer. He lay still on the floor, vague in the gloomy and imperfect light of the early dawn. Screwing up the last poor shred of my nerve, I went down to him. He was breathing. I was devoutly thankful for that. Yet another human life saved out of this night of wickedness. Gently as I could, I turned him on his back, and then I fetched water from the kitchen and sprinkled it on his face. I got a piece of glass stuck in my foot, too, for I had not put on my shoes since I had gone up just before 1 o'clock to Julia's room. Maybe it was partly the pain of that which made me feel like snickering, for that is how I did feel, even before I assured myself that Giles had been dazed by a heavy blow on the forehead and was not dying. When he opened his eyes and looked up at me, kneeling like a Mussulman behind him in the gloom, I wanted more than anything in the world to gibber. After a minute or two he recognized me, and then between his groans he said, "Something came down the stairs. It hit me. What the devil was it?" And that was just too much for me. I sat back on my stockinged heels, hid my face in my hands, and laughed like a fool. Well, here's an end to the strange story. You would not be interested in the convalescence of Eric and his wife. They were not your friends as they were mine. You never saw them. You never went into their queer house. What's more, you never will go into it, because it was burned down the following Christmas. Neither Annette nor I ever entered it again after the doctor came and took charge of Eric, bound up Giles's head, pronounced Julia recovering from her cold, drew the glass from my foot, and told my wife she looked tired and better go home for a little sleep. Julia was up the very next day and had Eric taken to New York. Later, while they were away, they hired men to move out their furniture and close up the house. It was presently for sale. No one knows how the fire that destroyed it started. By that time, the old place had been entirely deserted for more than 6 weeks. But oh, my own house, our good-looking little cement house. Nothing ever looked better to my eyes than that did the morning we returned to it. And it was still locked up tight, too. Felicia had obeyed Annette to the letter. She would never have opened a door or a window until hunger drove her out. I must confess that when we scurried up the granolithic walk, the little house did look like a county jail. You remember that's how Giles thought most of the houses in Forsby looked. But poor Giles didn't get a glimpse of it that morning. His head was aching very painfully. He swore he'd been struck by lightning. I remember I had to help him up to the front door, and I was limping at that. We must all have looked ridiculous. Little Bobby tumbled out on us like a puppy, and old Felicia mopped her eyes with the corner of her apron, muttering Christian thanks and glorifications. I don't suppose she knew just the nature of the peril which had threatened us, and which, glory be to God, we had escaped. But she had felt it. That is the infallible barometer. Now when I feel the creeps, I know there's something doing whether I see it or not, which God forbid I should ever see again. Dear old Giles. He had the strength of a bull. It took more than the blow of a ghost to lay him low in a blood-soaked field. Sometimes I wonder if he didn't really save us, if it wasn't he that shocked out of Eric the words that did the trick. When he left us, he asked me to drive to the station by way of the old house. We went right up to the front door in the Ford. Boards were nailed over the smashed glass panes in the door. Every window was shuttered. In perfect silence, we cast an eye over it all, each absorbed in his own thoughts. When we were back on the flat highway again, he said, turning away from me, "She is a fine woman, Pierre. I hope they will be happy now." There's lightning, and still another lightning, after all. As for Annette, she will not voluntarily recall those dreadful nights to her mind. In the 3 years that have passed, we have talked of them only once. I know she fears the effect of them upon me. That's all. She acknowledged, however, that there was something unusual in the house the night Julia was so sick and Eric went out of his head. Now, if I try to talk of it again, she looks at me as if I were out of my mind. That worries her, for I'm the breadwinner. So I go on commuting and keep my mouth shut about the upper or nether spheres. To tell the truth, I shall be glad when the memory has faded. Take it all in all, there was nothing in it but terrible suffering for Julia and Eric. You should see Forsby in the winter time. There's a foot of snow on the ground, now in the middle of January, and the nights are very cold. But it's healthy for the children. And hard as it is sometimes to get to and from the station in the Ford, we wouldn't move into the city for anything. Think of giving up the spotless fields and roads of snow for the city's soot, or the silence of the nights for the racket in town, or the whole expanse of clear black sky with its brilliant independent stars for the street lights and a rift between the rooftops. We have a blazing fire on the hearth every night, and we sit before it until it's time to go to bed, my wife and I, sometimes reading, sometimes talking, sometimes dreaming, but never haunted. A day or two ago we had a letter from Julia, who, with Eric, has gone to France. They're going to devote themselves and what is theirs to the alleviation of the great suffering that has come upon the world. I mustn't forget to tell you that Julia's small fortune has recently been increased. As for what Eric inherited from Morgan Snart, I will never, please heaven, write that name again. They have made that over to some relief organization. They too have gone, in the Red Cross. Last night I sat here before the fire with my pencil and my manuscript. Annette was reading one of the 2 new magazines to which we have subscribed, either The House Decorated or The Home Beautiful. Isn't that a funny trace of it all? I couldn't write anything. As you know, there's nothing more to write. My unguided pencil just went on scrawling over the paper, The Singing House. A piece of burning wood snapped and sent a big spark out on the rug. I got up to kick it back to the hearthstone, and then I went over to the door and went out on the porch. It was cold and still. There was no moon, and the stars were like diamonds, just as the mighty things will always go on being to humans when the air is clear. I looked to the north, and in my mind I saw the black spread of charred embers on the snow where the old house had stood. I could not hear a sound, and with my eyes could see nothing but the expanse of white snow, and a long way down the road to the right, a light in the window of our nearest neighbor's house. So I came back again to the fire, but not to try to write, just to think. Giles gone. Well, it will come to me too, and before long. But what a life to look back on. What a memory always, this house and this life of mine, and this wife and my children. That's the point. I've had it. Whereas Eric... They have gone, and we shall not see them again. At least, not for a long time. Only a mass of charred embers marks the place where their house of horror stood. Here is my wife, training her mind to see in houses a beauty she thought she missed in theirs. Here am I, regarding still as a nightmare what entered into my flesh as a most terrible reality and has, I know, colored my outlook upon life for the rest of my mortal days. What does it all amount to if it isn't just a story to tell? First and last, like all stories, not to be explained. Like all stories, first and last, true.
"There,"
said Annette to me, handing me over a chromo from the Home Beautiful,
"is a hanging on that wall like the one Julia had in her house. I wonder how a curtain or something would look on the wall upstairs. But I guess not. It would only catch the dust and things."
"Yes," I repeated, quite like a melancholy tragedian of the hollow old school. "Dust and things. Things and dust."
"What's the matter with you, Pierre? You're talking nonsense. You've been getting up and sitting down and going to the door as if you expected somebody to come."
I looked at her and grinned. "Nobody would come so late as this, my love."
"You've been working too long on that book. You're tired out, and you'd better go to bed."
"Annette," I said, laying my hand over hers, "there isn't any dust and things in this house. That's why we're so happy. Let's be sure there never is any." She gave me a funny look with her shrewd blue eyes.
"You mind your business, Pierre, and I'll mind mine. Now run along to bed. It's late."
So I locked the doors and windows, just as I always locked them, went upstairs after my wife, put out the lights downstairs from the switch on the upper floor, and made ready for bed. But before I turned in, I had to look out the window a little while. There wasn't a thing to see except stars and snow. Annette warned me that I should catch my death of cold. Well, after I'd put out the little light on the table by my bed, I strained my ears to hear something, and I heard the whistle of the last train from New York. There was not a sound in our dark house. "Surely," I whispered to my wife, finding her hand and giving her a good-night squeeze, "no one will come so late as this."
"Of course not. What are you thinking of?"
"Nothing."
"Go to sleep, then."
I did so, and met nothing on the way. End of Chapter 11. End of Sinister House by Leland Hall.